Power often speaks the loudest right before it realizes it has no idea who it's talking to. The courtroom in downtown Brookdale was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that carries the low rustle of paperwork, the faint squeak of polished shoes across tile, and the distant hum of traffic drifting through tall courthouse windows nearly 30 feet above the floor. Judge Robert Caldwell adjusted the papers in front of him while attorneys whispered to one another at their tables, expecting an ordinary procedural hearing that would last maybe 15 minutes. Then Officer Daniel Harper walked in. Harper was known around the Brookdale Police Department as a man who believed deeply in the authority of his badge. 6 feet tall, shoulders squared, uniform pressed sharp enough to cut paper. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that suggested he rarely expected anyone to question him. When his eyes landed on the woman standing near the witness rail, that confidence shifted into something colder. The woman stood calmly with her hands folded in front of her, dressed in a simple navy suit, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. Her name, according to the docket sheet sitting on the clerk's desk, was Angela Brooks. To Harper, she looked like someone who had come to make trouble for the department, another voice he believed was ready to challenge his version of events. He stepped closer, his voice echoing slightly across the courtroom's high ceiling as he began questioning her presence in a tone that carried more accusation than curiosity. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. It was unusual for an officer to speak that sharply before a judge had even called the session to order. But Angela Brooks did not react the way many people might have. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply looked at him with a quiet composure that seemed almost out of place in the tension building around them. The courtroom clerk paused mid-sentence while organizing a stack of files, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Judge Caldwell lifted his eyes from the bench, studying the exchange more carefully now. Harper continued, convinced he understood exactly who he was dealing with, certain that authority stood firmly on his side of the room. Yet something about Angela's calm unsettled the air. She listened to every word without interruption, her gaze steady, almost patient, as if she knew something no one else in the room had realized yet. A faint murmur moved through the gallery benches as observers tried to piece together why the woman remained so composed while the officer spoke with growing certainty. Then the judge cleared his throat and looked toward the clerk for clarification on the witness list. The clerk hesitated, glanced at the file again, and quietly slid a document toward the bench. Judge Caldwell read the top line once, then again, his eyebrows rising just slightly. The room grew still. Harper, still confident, had no reason to notice the shift yet. But within seconds, the simple hearing scheduled for that morning was about to become the most talked-about moment the Brookdale courthouse had seen in years. Officer Daniel Harper did not notice the subtle shift spreading across the courtroom, not at first. To him, the situation still felt simple and familiar, another moment where he believed he was correcting someone who had stepped too far into police business. He adjusted the cuff of his uniform and looked down at Angela Brooks with the same confident certainty he carried onto every street patrol in Brookdale. In his mind, the story had already been written. A complaint had been filed, a hearing scheduled, and now someone he assumed was another critic of the department was standing quietly in front of him. What Harper did not understand was that the quiet in the room had changed. It was no longer the routine silence of legal paperwork and waiting voices. It had become the kind of silence that builds when people sense something important about to unfold. Angela Brooks remained exactly where she had been standing since the moment Harper walked into the courtroom. Her posture was straight, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression calm enough that it almost seemed detached from the tension in the air. She did not interrupt Harper. She did not respond to the tone in his voice. Instead, she listened carefully, the way someone listens when they are allowing another person to reveal far more than they realize. Across the room, a court reporter paused with her fingers resting above the keyboard, watching the exchange with growing curiosity. A defense attorney sitting near the front bench slowly leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as if he had just realized this hearing might not follow the normal script. Judge Robert Caldwell kept his eyes on the document that the clerk had quietly placed in front of him moments earlier. The paper looked ordinary enough from a distance, just another administrative sheet among the many files that passed across the bench every day. But the name printed across the top line had made the judge pause. Angela Brooks. the same name that now stood only 20 feet away in the center of the courtroom. Caldwell glanced up again, studying the woman more closely this time. Her calm was not the nervous composure of someone facing authority. It looked more like patience. The kind of patience a person carries when they know the next few minutes will explain everything. Harper continued speaking, still convinced that control belonged to him. His voice echoed against the high wooden walls as he questioned why Angela Brooks was present and what she believed she was going to prove. In the gallery, a few observers exchanged quiet looks, sensing that the officer's confidence might soon collide with something he had not prepared for. Angela finally shifted slightly, not with anger or frustration, but with the slow, steady movement of someone ready to speak when the moment arrived. Judge Caldwell placed both hands on the bench and leaned forward. The room grew even quieter, the soft buzz of courthouse lights the only sound above the stillness. Then the judge spoke, his voice calm but deliberate as he addressed the woman standing before the court and asked her to clarify her position for the record, a question that seemed simple on the surface but carried a weight that only a few people in the room had begun to understand. Angela Brooks heard the judge's question and allowed a brief moment of silence to settle across the courtroom before she moved. It was not hesitation. It was intention. In that pause, the tension inside the room grew thick enough that even the people sitting in the back row leaned forward slightly, as if they sensed that whatever happened next would reshape the direction of the hearing. Officer Daniel Harper still stood with the same firm posture he had carried into the room, his shoulders squared and his attention fixed on Angela with a look that mixed impatience and certainty. He believed the situation was simple. From his perspective, this was a procedural matter that would be resolved once the court understood his side clearly enough. What he did not notice was how many eyes had begun shifting away from him and toward the woman he had been questioning. Angela took a slow breath and stepped forward just enough that her voice would carry clearly through the courtroom without effort. The movement was small, but it drew attention in a way loud gestures never could. Her composure did not break. If anything, it seemed to steady the atmosphere even more. The judge watched carefully, his hands resting flat against the wooden surface of the bench. The clerk beside him had already read the document twice and now waited quietly, aware that the next few words spoken in the room might travel far beyond these walls before the day ended. Harper crossed his arms, clearly expecting the explanation to confirm his assumptions. Angela looked briefly toward the judge and then allowed her gaze to pass calmly across the courtroom. The gallery, the attorneys, the court reporter, the bailiff standing near the door, each person watching with the same growing curiosity. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and measured, the tone of someone who had spent years inside rooms where clarity mattered more than volume. She explained that she had arrived in Brookdale less than 12 hours earlier, landing at the regional airport just after sunset the night before. The city lights had stretched across the highway as her car drove downtown, and by the time she reached the municipal building, the transition had already begun. She had not announced herself publicly yet. Most of the department had not even heard the news. But a formal document had already been signed early that morning. Judge Caldwell's eyes remained on her as she spoke, because the paper sitting on his desk matched every word she was now calmly describing. In the gallery, someone shifted in their seat, the sound of fabric against wood suddenly loud in the quiet room. Harper's expression tightened slightly, though he still seemed certain that whatever explanation was coming would not change his authority here. Angela paused again, just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle across the courtroom like the slow closing of a door. Then she continued, explaining that she was not present to argue a personal complaint, and she was not here simply as a witness. The reason she had walked into the courthouse that morning had a very different purpose, one that would soon require every person in the room to reconsider exactly who held authority inside Brookdale's police department. Angela Brooks allowed her final words to settle into the quiet courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. For a moment, nobody moved. The air felt different now, heavier, as if every person in the room sensed that something larger than a routine hearing was slowly revealing itself. Officer Daniel Harper shifted his weight slightly, the first visible crack in the certainty he had carried since walking through the courtroom doors. He had expected resistance, maybe even an argument, but not this calm explanation that seemed to move step by step toward a conclusion he could not yet see. Harper glanced briefly toward the judge as if waiting for the bench to interrupt and return the hearing to familiar ground. But Judge Robert Caldwell did not interrupt. Instead, he watched Angela with the same careful attention he reserved for moments that could change the direction of a case. The document on his desk remained open, its official seal catching a faint reflection from the overhead lights. Angela continued speaking with the same steady tone, explaining that her arrival in Brookdale had been arranged quietly over several weeks by the city council and the mayor's office. The department had been searching for new leadership after months of growing tension between the police force and the community it served. Several candidates had been considered across the country. Interviews had taken place in offices far from the attention of local reporters. In the end, one name had appeared again and again in those discussions: Angela Brooks, a law enforcement professional with years of leadership experience in 2 major metropolitan departments and a reputation for restoring trust in cities that had struggled with division. In the gallery, a man seated near the back slowly leaned forward, his expression shifting from curiosity to surprise as the details began forming a picture he had not expected to hear inside a courtroom that morning. Harper remained silent now, but the confidence in his posture had begun to fade. Angela's voice never rose. She simply continued laying out the facts the way someone presents a timeline that cannot be argued with. She described how she had spent the previous evening reviewing reports about Brookdale, reading internal evaluations, and studying the department she was about to lead. Among those reports had been a number of recent incidents that raised serious concerns about public trust and professional conduct. Angela did not accuse anyone directly. She did not need to. The meaning behind her words was already filling the room. Judge Caldwell rested his hands together and glanced briefly at Harper before returning his attention to Angela. The courtroom had grown so quiet that even the faint ticking of the wall clock above the rear door could be heard between sentences. Then Angela took one small step forward and spoke the words that finally connected every piece of the story. She explained that early that very morning, before most of the city had finished their first cup of coffee, the mayor had signed the official appointment order. The document confirming that decision was the same paper now sitting on the judge's bench, and the position it described was the highest authority inside the Brookdale Police Department, a fact that Officer Daniel Harper was about to understand in a way he had never expected. The words hung in the air with a weight that seemed to press against every wall of the courtroom. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The faint ticking of the clock above the rear door continued its steady rhythm, marking time in a room that suddenly felt frozen between one moment and the next. Angela Brooks stood calmly where she had been speaking, her posture unchanged, her voice no longer filling the space, but her presence somehow larger than before. Officer Daniel Harper stared at her, trying to process what he had just heard. Only minutes earlier he had believed he understood exactly who stood across from him. In his mind, she had been a stranger questioning the department he served, someone he believed he had the authority to challenge. Now the explanation unfolding in front of the entire courtroom had begun to shift that belief piece by piece. Harper glanced toward the judge's bench again, almost instinctively searching for confirmation that he had misunderstood something. Judge Robert Caldwell slowly lifted the document that rested on the polished wood surface in front of him. The official seal of the city of Brookdale caught the light from the overhead fixtures as the judge examined the page one more time. He had already read the name twice earlier, but now the meaning of the document carried a very different presence in the room. Angela watched quietly, giving the judge the time he needed to verify what the paper clearly stated. In the gallery, several observers leaned forward, whispering softly to one another as the significance of the situation began spreading from seat to seat. A reporter sitting near the aisle had already taken out a small notebook, sensing that the events unfolding inside the courtroom might soon reach far beyond the courthouse steps. Harper remained still, his confident stance slowly replaced by uncertainty that he could not easily hide. Angela finally spoke again, her tone measured and steady as before. She explained that the appointment order signed earlier that morning was already active under city law. The transition of leadership within the Brookdale Police Department had officially taken effect at 8 o'clock sharp, the exact time recorded on the mayor's signature line at the bottom of the document. That detail mattered because the clock on the courtroom wall now read only a few minutes past 9. which meant that for more than an hour the city already had a new police chief. Angela Brooks allowed that fact to settle into the quiet room without raising her voice or changing her calm expression. The truth did not need volume. It only needed clarity. Judge Caldwell nodded slowly as he placed the document back on the bench. His eyes moved from the paper to Angela and finally toward Officer Harper. The shift of attention was small but unmistakable. Authority inside the courtroom had just realigned itself in a way few people had expected when the hearing began earlier that morning. Harper felt the weight of every gaze turning in his direction. The same badge that had given him such certainty when he walked into the room now seemed to carry a different meaning under the steady light of the courtroom ceiling. Angela did not look angry. She did not appear triumphant. Instead, she looked like someone who had simply allowed the truth to arrive exactly when it was supposed to. And in that quiet moment, everyone present began to realize that the morning's hearing had just transformed into something far more significant than anyone had predicted when the doors first opened. The quiet inside the courtroom no longer felt ordinary. It felt like the moment just before. A storm changes direction. Every person present could sense that something important had shifted, even if only a few fully understood why. Officer Daniel Harper stood in the same place he had occupied since the hearing began, but the confidence that once filled his posture had begun to fade under the steady attention of the room. The badge on his uniform still reflected the courtroom lights, but now it seemed less like a shield and more like a symbol that carried expectations he had not considered only minutes earlier. Angela Brooks remained composed, her expression calm as she allowed the silence to settle after the truth of her appointment had been placed clearly on the table. She did not rush the moment. Experience had taught her that people often reveal the most about themselves when they are given time to understand what has just happened. Judge Robert Caldwell looked toward the gallery for a brief moment, observing the quiet ripple of reactions moving through the audience benches. A few whispers traveled from one row to another before fading again beneath the weight of the courtroom atmosphere. The judge then turned his attention back to the center of the room, where Angela and Harper stood facing one another across only a few feet of polished wood floor. Caldwell's voice finally broke the silence, calm and deliberate as always. He acknowledged the document confirming Angela Brooks as the newly appointed chief of police for the city of Brookdale. The statement carried the authority of the bench, and once spoken aloud it left little room for misunderstanding. The room seemed to exhale collectively. Harper's eyes moved briefly toward the document on the judge's desk, and then back toward Angela. The realization was beginning to take shape, slow but undeniable. Angela spoke again, not with accusation but with the steady clarity of someone addressing a matter of responsibility. She explained that leadership inside a police department was not simply about rank or titles. It was about trust. Communities trusted officers to carry the law with fairness. Departments trusted their officers to represent the values written into every oath of service. When that trust weakened, the damage traveled far beyond a single incident. Her words were calm but firm, spoken with the quiet authority that comes from years of experience inside institutions that depend on discipline and integrity. Several attorneys seated along the side benches listened carefully, recognizing the tone of someone accustomed to leading large organizations. Harper remained silent now. The certainty that had filled his earlier remarks had been replaced by something more complicated, a mixture of confusion and realization that seemed to weigh on his expression. Angela did not speak to embarrass him. She spoke because the moment demanded clarity. The position she now held meant that every action taken by officers in Brookdale ultimately reflected the standards she was responsible for upholding. Judge Caldwell watched both individuals carefully. In his many years on the bench, he had seen countless confrontations unfold inside that courtroom, but very few carried the quiet gravity of this one. What had begun as a routine hearing had transformed into a moment that would likely echo through the entire department by the end of the day. And as the room waited to see what would happen next, one thing had become unmistakably clear to everyone present. Authority in Brookdale had just taken on a new voice, and it spoke with a calm that could not be ignored. The silence that followed Angela Brooks' words carried a different weight now, the kind that settles over a room when people realize they are witnessing a turning point. The courtroom lights hummed softly above polished wooden benches, and outside the tall windows the city of Brookdale continued its ordinary morning without knowing that something important had just shifted inside the courthouse walls. Officer Daniel Harper remained standing where he was, but his posture had changed in subtle ways that everyone in the room could see. Only minutes earlier he had spoken with the certainty of someone who believed authority belonged firmly on his side of the room. Now that certainty had begun to unravel under the calm presence of the woman standing only a few feet away. Angela Brooks did not move closer, and she did not raise her voice. She simply held Harper's gaze for a moment before allowing her attention to pass briefly across the courtroom, acknowledging the judge, the attorneys, and the observers who had become unexpectedly invested in what was unfolding. Her composure was steady, almost quiet in its strength. It was the demeanor of someone who understood that leadership was not proven through loud commands, but through clarity when it mattered most. Judge Robert Caldwell watched carefully, his hands folded together on the bench. Years on the bench had taught him to recognize the moments when the meaning of a hearing expanded beyond the paperwork that first brought people into the room. This was one of those moments. Angela spoke again, her tone calm, but unmistakably firm. She explained that the position she now held carried a responsibility not only to the city, but also to every officer who wore the same badge that Officer Harper wore. Leadership meant ensuring that every action taken by the department reflected fairness, discipline, and respect for the law itself. Those values were not abstract ideas written in policy manuals. They were standards that shaped how communities viewed the people sworn to protect them. Several people seated in the gallery nodded quietly, recognizing the truth behind those words. Harper listened without interrupting. The confidence that had once filled his expression had been replaced by something more reflective, as though the meaning of the situation was finally settling in piece by piece. Angela did not accuse him directly. Instead, she spoke about the importance of accountability within any organization that holds authority over the public. She explained that moments of misunderstanding or misjudgment could happen in any profession, but what defined a department's integrity was how those moments were addressed once they came into the light. The courtroom remained still as she spoke. Even the faint shuffle of papers had stopped. Judge Caldwell finally leaned forward slightly, his voice entering the conversation once again. He noted that the purpose of the hearing had changed considerably from what had originally been scheduled earlier that morning. What began as a simple procedural matter now carried broader implications regarding professional conduct and departmental leadership. Angela nodded slightly, acknowledging the judge's observation without breaking the calm rhythm of the moment. Across the room, Officer Harper seemed to realize that the next words spoken inside this courtroom would likely shape not only the outcome of the hearing, but also the direction of his own future within the department he had served for years. And as the quiet tension returned to the room, everyone present waited to see what the newly appointed chief would choose to do next. The atmosphere in the courtroom had grown so quiet that every movement seemed amplified. The soft scrape of a chair leg against the floor, the faint rustle of a jacket sleeve, even the low hum of the courthouse. Lights above became part of the tension that filled the space. Officer Daniel Harper stood still, but inside his mind the moment was beginning to feel very different from the one he had walked into earlier that morning. The confidence that once carried his words had faded into something heavier. The realization that the situation in front of him had shifted far beyond a simple courtroom exchange. Angela Brooks remained calm, her posture steady, her presence neither confrontational nor distant. She understood that moments like this were rarely about one person alone. They were about what a moment revealed to everyone watching. Judge Robert Caldwell studied both individuals carefully from the bench. His years in the courtroom had taught him that the most meaningful turning points often happened quietly, without raised voices or dramatic gestures. What mattered were the decisions that followed once the truth had settled into the room. Angela finally spoke again, her tone measured but clear enough that every person present could hear the intention behind her words. She explained that leadership within the Brookdale Police Department would not be defined by intimidation or assumptions. It would be defined by accountability, professionalism, and respect for every member of the community the department served. Her voice carried no anger, only conviction shaped by years of experience. She acknowledged that every officer, including Officer Harper, had chosen a profession built on responsibility. The badge they wore was not simply a symbol of authority. It represented the public trust placed in them by the people they were sworn to protect. Angela paused briefly, allowing those words to settle before continuing. She explained that moments of conflict inside institutions could become opportunities to reinforce the standards those institutions were meant to uphold. What mattered most was how those moments were addressed once they came into the open. Across the courtroom, several observers nodded quietly, recognizing the balance in her approach. She was not speaking to humiliate anyone. She was speaking to clarify the expectations that now stood under her leadership. Officer Harper listened carefully, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet awareness that the direction of the morning had moved somewhere he had not anticipated. Angela's calm presence made it clear that the authority she carried did not rely on confrontation. It relied on the simple weight of responsibility. Judge Caldwell leaned slightly forward and spoke again, his voice steady as. He acknowledged that the court recognized Angela Brooks as the newly appointed chief of police for the city of Brookdale. The official confirmation echoed through the courtroom like a final piece clicking into place. Harper lowered his gaze for a moment, absorbing the meaning behind the judge's words. Angela looked toward him once more, not with judgment, but with the measured seriousness of someone who understood the responsibility now resting on her shoulders. The future of the department would be shaped by what happened next. And as the room waited in silence, everyone present could feel that the final decision in this moment would reveal exactly what kind of leadership Brookdale had just received. The quiet inside the courtroom lingered for several long seconds after Judge Robert Caldwell confirmed Angela Brooks as the new chief of police for the city of Brookdale. The statement had settled into the room like the final note of a bell, clear and impossible to ignore. No one rushed to speak. Even the small movements that normally filled a courthouse seemed to pause as every person present waited to see how the moment would end. Officer Daniel Harper stood with his eyes lowered briefly toward the polished floor before slowly lifting his gaze again. The confidence that had once driven his words earlier that morning had transformed into something more thoughtful. It was the look of someone realizing that authority did not always appear in the form he expected. Angela Brooks remained composed, her presence steady and calm. She understood that leadership was tested not only when things were easy, but especially in moments when people were forced to reconsider their assumptions. Angela finally spoke again, her voice carrying through the courtroom with quiet clarity. She explained that the responsibility she now held was not about winning an argument or proving someone wrong. It was about restoring confidence in the institution that both she and Officer Harper had sworn to serve. Every badge represented a promise to the public, a promise that fairness and respect would guide every decision made under that authority. Angela turned slightly, so her words reached everyone seated in the gallery, as well as the officers standing across from her. She spoke about the importance of reflection within any profession that holds power. Mistakes could happen, misunderstandings could occur, but the true measure of integrity came from how individuals responded once those moments were revealed. Judge Caldwell listened quietly, recognizing the calm balance in her tone. Angela was not speaking to create embarrassment. She was speaking to set the standard for the future. Officer Harper took a slow breath as the meaning of her words settled in. The room waited, uncertain whether he would respond. Finally, he straightened his posture, the movement small but noticeable. Without raising his voice, he acknowledged that the situation had unfolded very differently than he had expected when he first walked into the courtroom. His words were careful, chosen with the awareness that everyone present was listening closely. Angela gave a slight nod, accepting the acknowledgement without turning the moment into a confrontation. Leadership, she understood, sometimes meant allowing people the space to recognize their own lessons. Judge Caldwell then brought the session toward its conclusion, noting that the hearing had revealed issues that would likely be addressed further within the department under its new leadership. The gavel tapped lightly once against the bench, signaling the formal end of the proceeding. As people slowly began to rise from their seats, quiet conversations spread through the gallery. Some observers shook their heads in disbelief, while others simply looked toward Angela Brooks with newfound respect. Officer Harper remained still for a moment longer before turning toward the exit, his thoughts clearly heavier than when the morning had begun. Angela gathered her documents calmly, preparing to step into the role that now carried the trust of an entire city. And as the courthouse doors opened to the busy streets of Brookdale, one simple truth lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the moment. A badge may carry authority, but true leadership reveals itself in the quiet strength to transform conflict into accountability.